President, fellows, guests, most honoured to be able to address the Society. And what I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about Egyptian coffins in general, and also then talk a little bit about some of the particular things that come up while undertaking some ongoing research into them, including some rather cautionary tales about how things probably shouldn't go in public collections. Just to start off with, just to sort of, for those of you who are not sort of fully au fait with ancient Egyptian history, just this little slide, I think this gives you an idea that when we talk about ancient Egypt, we're talking about an extremely long period of time, compared with which the Roman Empire or something is very much a flash in the pan and doesn't really count for very much time-wise. I will try and avoid sort of going into great chronological detail, but be aware there are these things called kingdoms, old, middle and new, and then it all rather sort of fizzles out into an intermediate period, a late period, and a Ptolemaic period, and then the Romans take over. And just again, that's where the pyramids are and all that. It's always worthwhile doing this kind of thing, because certainly when my students, for example, the concept of time depth seems to be rather alien to the present generation of undergraduates. To start off with, a little bit about the history of the Egyptian coffin, container for the dead, shall we say. The very earliest ones are made of nothing particularly spectacular. In fact, some of the earliest things one probably catalogue as coffins are actually basketry. This particular example in the British Museum is a good example of one of those early things. And it also shows an important facet of early Egyptian burials, which is the pose, which is lying on their left-hand side with the knees drawn up in a fetal position. And that continues on for some centuries beyond the unification of Egypt. This isn't purely a prehistoric thing, which people often tend to take away. And as such, the earliest thing which we'd probably recognise as coffins, i.e. at least sort of wooden boxes for bodies, are short and stumpy. They are, to their proportion, representing the fact you've got one of these crouched bodies inside. But even quite early on, these are actually quite more than just simply a wooden box. And there's quite a bit of symbolism built into this. For example, when we look at this one, you see that the lid has got a rounded section with raised end pieces. This actually is the form of one of the Egyptian standard shrines, the so-called Keranu, and therefore it's immediately seen, particularly in this very early period, that there is the concept of the coffin being a shrine containing within which the dead dwells. And the same kind of idea of dwelling or a shrine is also borne out by the panelling on the exterior, often called palace facade, which is intended to represent the exterior of a high-status building. So the whole thing is far more than just simply a container for the deceased. It's in many ways a home for the deceased. And that kind of concept of the coffin as having a much greater level of importance than simply as a way of containing the dead body, is also seen when we move on in the Middle Kingdom to coffins which contain a body which is fully stretched out. There's a gradual process. They start off in this fetal position, then a few hundred years on into the Old Kingdom, we find them being slightly more stretched out as though in the pose of being asleep, and then a little bit later on they're fully stretched out. Although throughout this they're always lying on the left-hand side, and that position, lying on the left-hand side, is quite important when we look at the decoration of this particular example, which is a fairly typical coffin of the Middle Kingdom, which is in big handfuls, about 2000 BC down to about 1700 BC. And you see here there is this eye panel here. that the face of the mummy, often adorned with a mask, lies behind that, that panel. And the idea is that it allows the body to see out. What you may sometimes find is actually a pile of offerings outside this part, outside here. So actually the mummy is looking out towards the direction from which offerings will come. The Egyptian belief was that the dead dwelt in the west, and therefore the offerings are coming from the east towards that point. Also, looking at this coffin, there are other quite important things here about the posthumous destiny of the deceased. For example, the horizontal band of text there is a formula intended to magically produce food. One thing which is very, very clear is the Egyptians were always terrified of the idea that they might go hungry in the next world. Tombs contain real food. In chapels, real offerings were supposed to be brought and placed for the deceased. It was recognised that that wasn't going to last forever, and therefore the production of food by means of a magic formula was introduced, and that is normally the contents of the horizontal band on this kind of coffin. And then the vertical column of text here, each of these invokes one of the protective deities of the deceased. And the idea therefore being that this text is producing food, and this text is invoking these protective deities, which are almost standing in guard around the body. And later on, we actually find coffins whereby these deities are actually depicted. But here, just simply naming them is sufficient. So you've effectively got this guard of deities around the long sides, and also there is normally one of the protective goddesses of the dead placed at the head and the foot. So the idea is there's almost a magical force field being produced around the coffin by that. And inside the lid here, there is often a depiction of stars, therefore showing that the lid has a role as almost being the sky. Again, there's an idea that the tomb at one kind of level and the coffin at another level are effectively the cosmos in a box, effectively, and that's part of that. And inside this kind of coffin, one often finds a lot of decoration as well, which further reinforces its magical role. Amongst other things, there are depictions of various items that the dead wish to have with them in the next world, and also the whole idea of food is further reinforced. On this particular one, this is actually a granary which is depicted on the end here. So again, making sure that foodstuffs are available for the deceased. And there's also we have a large number of texts here in very cursive hieroglyphs, which are known as the coffin texts. And these are magic spells which both aid the transition of the deceased from this world to the next, provide the protection for them, and also supplemented in this particular case by an actual map of the underworld on the floor of the coffin. So it's almost a guidebook to being dead is being provided here. And these coffin texts then grow into something probably more familiar with, which is the Book of the Dead, which is another compilation of these kinds of texts, normally found on papyrus rolls, which come in the way after the Middle Kingdom. So there's a process here of the production of these texts, which are to guarantee food and happiness in the next world. Now, for the first sort of 1,000 years or so of the production of coffins, they are simply wooden boxes, rather elaborate wooden boxes in many cases. However, around about 1650, 1700 or so BC, a new sort of coffin becomes generally used. Now this kind of coffin had actually come into existence a little earlier on, but only as something to be found within one of these rectangular coffins. And its subsidiary nature was indicated by the fact that it was found lying on its left-hand side, just like the body inside. These are what most people nowadays would tend to recognise as Egyptian coffins or mummy cases. Some of the earliest examples are just simply almost extensions of the facial masks, which are often found on earlier mummies. But then, so around this kind of time, 1700, 1650 or so, the Anthropoid or mummiform coffin becomes a standalone item in its own right. And signalling that is the fact that at this point suddenly the body starts lying on its back for the first time. Up until then it's always been on its left-hand side. With the introduction of these Anthropoid coffins, it lies on its back and remains on its back for the remainder of Egyptian history. This particular, when the coffin becomes, the Anthropoid coffin becomes something which is an independent container, it doesn't have to be contained in a rectangular one. It also has a feature of this feathering. You can see here you've got wings effectively sprouting from the shoulders of the coffin, and then laid down on the front of the body. The exact meaning of this kind of winged patterning has been much debated within Egyptology, and there's still not really consensus. But the most likely thing seems to be that it's a evocation of the bar bird. The bar is one of the 5 versions of the spirit which came into existence after a person's death and was a human-headed bird. And if one thinks about the way that the wings sprout from the shoulders and are then wrapped there down the front of the body, it seems most likely that these represent, the idea is to represent the dead body as a human-headed bird, i.e. the bar bird, which is the version of the spirit which is able to go out and about after death. There's 5 different versions of the spirit, but this is the one which is the mobile version, if you like. These actually were for kings. This one was originally seems to have been provided for him in a hurry after premature death. It's actually the sort of coffin which was made for stock, because the names on it have been filled in blank space which have been left by the coffin maker. The other one is a more purposely made royal coffin gilt with gold foil on the exterior, but actually engraved into that gold foil surface is the same feathered pattern that we see here. And this kind of feathered coffin, which starts off as being available for everybody, rapidly becomes a royal special, amongst those famous ones being the coffins of Tutankhamun. By this time, the feathering has become much, much more stylised, and if you hadn't actually got the example of those earlier ones with the wings very clearly shown, one probably wouldn't realise that the highly stylised patterning on this coffin, the middle of the 3 coffins used for Tutankhamun's burial, you probably wouldn't realise where it was coming from. In this particular case, this is glass inlaid into the surface here, on a wooden carcass with gold foil, but then extensive inlay in coloured glass, which during this period, the Egyptian New Kingdom, was widely produced in Egypt and represents one of the a high point in glass working in the ancient world. Interestingly, so while that kind of feathered coffin actually is used for royal burial for something like 600 years, for private individuals, other types of coffin rapidly replace it. And one of the things which is possible to do when you study Egyptian coffins is to note a fairly rapid turnover in types, which allows chronology, up to a certain point anyway, to be identified quite well through typology. And one of those kinds of coffins is this one, the so-called white coffin, which is intended, which is a very, very simple conception, in contrast to somewhat more sophisticated idea lying behind the feathered coffins. This one effectively depicts an enshrouded mummy wearing a mask. So a mask over the head and shoulders. The white is the linen shroud, and then you've got these transverse bands holding hold a real shroud in place. But here, of course, is being used as an artistic motif to include texts. And these texts are basically the same text which we saw in the rectangular coffins. Although you've moved to a different shape of coffin, the conception remains the same, and the texts here are providing for offerings, and the other ones are providing protection from the various protected deities. Interestingly enough, although the eye panel is no longer appropriate because the mummy is now lying on its back, eyes on the sides of coffins continue in use. When one looks at Egyptian funerary practice, it's interesting to see that quite often a feature appears which originally has a practical role. Okay, this is a theological role, but it has the role of allowing the body to see out. But is then retained even after it's no longer required, because now the body's on its back and has got perfectly good eyes to look out from the face. But say these eyes continue on the sides of coffins for millennia after they've actually gone out of their practical purpose. Around this kind of time, there's a fairly rapid turnover in coffin designs, or at least in their coloration. The white coffin is fairly rapidly replaced by the so-called black coffin. Black is an important colour in Egyptian theology, or at least funerary theology. It's a colour of rebirth. The Egyptians took the view that there was an agricultural parallelism between rebirth and the first growth of a new season. The Nile flooded every year and covered the fields with a black layer of nuclear soil, and from that the first green shoots of the new season's planting came out. So therefore, black and green are two colours of rebirth, and not only do you find coffins at various periods black, but also you find that funerary deities are often shown with black skin because of the black silt which had been placed on the fields by inundation, and which was the basis for the regrowth of the fields, and also symbolically of rebirth of the deceased. Soon a few generations further on, the coloration shifts again to the yellow coffin. So these names are fairly descriptive. And and I think you can see from the examples here that what you've now got is, rather than white or black being the predominant colour, it's now yellow. Yellow being the colour of the flesh of the gods. So all these colours have significance. Although at least initially, the iconography on these coffins hasn't changed significantly. And just to go back to that previous one for a moment, I mentioned earlier on that you get the depictions of some of these protected deities. Well, that's what we've got here. The figures along the side of the trough of the coffin here are the protected deities of the deceased, of the dead, who are invoked on the columns of text adjacent to them. Though interestingly, we do get a short period where the idea ultimately of the coffin as representing the masked mummy disappears, and then we have a few examples of coffins like the ones on the right here, which show the deceased as though alive, not as a mummy, but actually wearing their daily life dress. This only occurs for perhaps 50 to 100 years, and we're unclear why there is this sort of sudden move to this, then it goes away again. So it's quite useful as a dating criteria to see this kind of coffin. Now the yellow coloured coffins carry on for a long period of time. They're far more long-lived than the white or black type. and they run on for perhaps three centuries or more. However, within that, they are quite easily datable because there's a tendency towards a horror vacui in the decoration of these things. Initially, there's, as you saw on the white and black coffin, there's lots of space around the vignettes and texts. But as you move through time, you get the artist tries to shoehorn more and more text and vignette into the area available. And the example there on the left there is a good one showing the sheer density of decoration. Also, as far as dating these things is concerned, one can also look at other features. Although the basic concept remains the same, the way that the vignettes are laid out changes. But most noticeably, you get around about 950 or so BC. Suddenly, rather than being a rather in the background here, there's always a collar around the neck of these things. Suddenly, the coffin, the collar just becomes grossly overgrown, going right down to the waist, which is a nice dating criterion. As also as the appearance of red braces along the front of them. So there are some useful hooks that one can deal with here. Also, without even being able to read the texts on them, one can sex the intended occupant, because you know that the hands are in fists. That's a male attribute, and then in this particular case, the hands are out flat, which is a female attribute. And also, you often find also the breasts shown, and sometimes also earrings on the female ones as well. On the other hand, sometimes the mummy you find in such coffins is not the gender it's supposed to be. Because one thing we do, with the period when these are being made, from roughly about 1100 BC down to about 900, Egypt's economy is not in a particularly good state. It's lost its foreign dependencies, the availability of good quality wood from outside Egypt, because native Egyptian wood is fairly poor quality from the point of view of decent carpentry. You start finding that these coffins start getting reused. And a nice example is this one here in Copenhagen. As it stands, it looks like a nice one, probably of somewhere around about 1000 to 950 BC. That's fairly okay. Then one starts having a closer look at it, and one has a look at the foot. And you can see here, emerging out of the broken away mud plaster, a human foot. Well, a carved human, I'm not saying a real human foot, a carved human foot. And what does this mean? Well, those sorts of human feet go with this kind of coffin lid, which, as I said before, was made some centuries earlier on. And in fact, one of the strange things which have been noticed in Egyptian archaeology is relatively few New Kingdom coffins survive. A colleague from the University of California, Los Angeles, is currently looking at these in a lot of detail, and she's estimating that of this kind of yellow coffin from this period, 1100 through to about 900 or so, at least 25% of them have got older coffins inside them. There was an orgy of tomb robbery around about between about 1100 and 1050 or so BC. And during which time mummies were torn to pieces for their jewellery. So what seems to have happened is after these robberies took place, coffin merchants, if you can coin that term, went around picking up the now empty coffins around the necropolis, took them back to their workshops, and then on the carcasses replastered them, repainted them, and then resold them. And hence this is an example of that. And also, even within that period, ones are being reused. So sometimes the gender of the person inside doesn't necessarily match the design of the coffin outside, although some sex change operations were carried out on certain coffins. So although this period is this period is not as economically prosperous as others, there is some nice stuff being produced, however, at the royal end of the market. For example, these two kings, Susenes I and Shoshenq IIa, both were given silver coffins. Susenes I is feathered. It's the last example of this 600-year process of making feathered coffins for kings. Though interestingly enough, the next one which we have in the record, there's a gap unfortunately in preservation. Although the body decoration is no longer feathered, the head is that of a raptor. So there seems to be an intention, a desire to maintain an avian aspect of the burial of a king. Now I mentioned that these yellow coffins, there was a severe horror vacui with them. This horror vacui seems to sort of suddenly disappears, and a whole new type of coffin comes into use with a much have dense decoration. And indeed, in a nest of them, like this particular set here, you can see that the outermost two have got virtually no decoration at all, apart from a basic text and the depiction of the face of the deceased. So it's rather interesting how suddenly it almost seemed that the density of decoration has got all too much, and there's a decision to rein it all back to something far more simple. Also, the fact that mummies have been ripped to pieces by robbers seems to may well have influenced the fact that along with this new style of coffin, a new kind of inner case is produced, like this kind here. And this is actually almost like, basically, it's made as a casing which is laced up at the back and then plastered over and completely sealed. So the body is actually completely sealed in a solid casing, which is then decorated. With the same kind of symbolism which had previously been used, but the very fact that these things cannot be got out of these things without destroying the casing, one wonders whether there's a degree of security involved here. I was talking earlier on about the symbolism of the colour black. Well, what's interesting with some of these cases is you can see they're gorgeously decorated in polychrome, yet quite a few of them, once they were put in their coffins, were then covered over with what's technically called black goo. For example, this one here. This one, much of the main part of the body has been covered over. There are some examples where the entire decoration of one of these inner casings has been completely covered over with the black. Clearly, it's again that black symbolism being used here. Things move on further. So there's, apart from the fact the yellow coffin has a very, very long life, most other ones seem to sort of turn over every couple of centuries or so. And this kind of solid internal casing disappears and is replaced by an ordinary kind of coffin once again. And this is an example of the next sort of generation. What's interesting here is to note that the middle coffin here keeps that very simple design of earlier ones, yet the outer coffin and inner coffin are once again very intricately decorated, and we're almost moving back towards a bit more of a horror vacui kind of situation. And this kind of nest of coffins can also sometimes be placed within a rectangle. Within a rectangular wooden outer sarcophagus, which is again this move on of the various kinds of design. Up until this point, let's say we've got a pretty good granularity of the development of these things. However, after about 650, we have a much greater problem in identifying precise dates of Egyptian coffins. Up until this point, you can normally date them by reference to kings being mentioned or the individuals being known from external sources, genealogies and so on. But after this it becomes much more problematic. It's one of the reasons why when one looks at labelling of coffins in museums, when you suddenly get things marked late period to Greco-Roman, simply because there's not a useful hook to be able to provide a better kind of dating. And in Roman time, Greco-Roman time particularly, we get some rather interesting things whereby Hellenistic art and Egyptian art are sort of brought together with these kinds of things. Here, we've got a very sort of typical kind of Egyptian coffin here. However, the plaster heads of these are clearly from a different genre of artistic tradition, certainly not from the Egyptian one. Now, that overview really just is to lead into my second part, which is to talk a little bit about some of my experiences while actually trying to undertake some of this cataloguing of Egyptian coffins, which we mentioned. This all started off when I was asked to help out with the first volume of catalogue of the Egyptian collection of the National Museum of Scotland, which produced this volume back in 2010. And the NMS certainly has a very nice eclectic collection of coffins, including this particular one, which was found by Flinders Petrie, the well-known Egyptologist, back in 1909 at Kerner, which is part of Thebes, directly opposite on Luxor. It's a very rich thing. As you can see, it's one of these feathered coffins, which allows it to be dated to about 1650 or so BC. It was intact burial, albeit not in a particularly exotic kind of tomb, simply a cutting in the gravel in which it had been placed, along with the funerary equipment, which has got quite a few things in it which are of Nubian origin, to the south of Egypt, suggesting the lady in question may have had Nubian affiliations. Unfortunately, working out exactly who she was is harmed by the fact that the area where her name and titles would be, just here, is broken away. Not for any sinister reason. If you look at how the coffin is lying there in its original location, this is the coffin of a child, presumably her child, and it's been put in the grave directly on top of the point where the inscription, the name and title of the deceased would be. So it appears it's simply been dropped by the workman, which has then has cracked away the gilded plaster on which the name was. So for a long time, she was just simply a high status lady. But then, some years ago, a colleague of mine at the NMS and I spent a whole morning having a look at what you could actually make out from the broken edge of where the text was. And we were able to convince ourselves that what you could just see was one of the signs for a title of Egyptian queen. Now, given the high quality of this coffin, the amount of gold and so on, at a period which was fairly impoverished, that sort of ties in quite nicely. So unfortunately, I don't know her name, but at least the high quality of the burial is partly explained if she's indeed the wife of a king. But there's also this intriguing Nubian connection, because during the period in question, the Nubians were, at least some periods, the bitter enemies of the Egyptian regime, having invaded Egypt at least once during this kind of period, 1700 through to about 1600 or so BC. So quite an intriguing piece here, now known colloquially as Queenie. Also in Scotland, at the Kelvingrove Museum, is this rather interesting stone coffin, made from a man called Pabassa around about 650 or so BC. It's interesting in various ways. First of all, it doesn't really conform to what coffins were normally like at the time he died. We've got no doubts about where he fits in. He's a well-known historical figure. It's actually the design is based on that of the kind of coffin which had been made back 1,000 years earlier on. If you remember the black coffin particularly, the layout of the deities, the texts and so on is lifted directly from that. And it's a period of Egyptian history where they're getting things back together again after a long period of civil war and foreign domination. And we know that the period has a lot of looking back to a glorious past. And to do so, this particular gentleman had commissioned a coffin which was not of the current effete style, but actually one which goes back well over 1,000 years to a design current when things were rather better. Now, this coffin has also interest in the fact it was owned and came to the Kelvin Grove Museum from the collections of the Dukes of Hamilton. And it had been acquired by this gentleman, Alexander, 10th Duke of Hamilton, a fellow of our society, known during his lifetime as El Magnifico. He regarded himself as the legitimate heir to the Scottish throne. He had massive residences dotted throughout the UK. And during his career as a collector, and Hamilton Palace, which is unfortunately now been demolished, was filled with his collections, and they included 2 Egyptian stone coffins. The one which ultimately passed to the Kelvin Grove Museum, but also this one here, in which he was actually buried. The story of its acquisition is a bit of a comedy of errors. He was a trustee of the British Museum, and he was in Paris and wrote back that there was this rather fine Egyptian stone coffin to be had, and would the museum like him to buy it for them? Well, unfortunately, the trustees had up to that story before then been discussing the purchase of an Egyptian sarcophagus which was on sale in Paris. And the trustees put 2 and 2 together and made 5. They thought that the Duke was offering to buy the one which they were interested in. So he bought it. The money was passed to him by the British Museum. The British Museum, the crate appeared from Paris at the British Museum. The lid was opened, and they found not the sarcophagus they thought they were buying. And there is a note in the BM records that they feared the Duke had been humbugged by those rascally Frenchmen. Actually, it turned out, no, they got their wires crossed completely, and the trustees thought he was buying one, but he knew he was buying this one. So basically he said, well, if you don't want it, I'll take it off your hands. Yes, please, they said, and we have to check next week. So having got this one, he decided to be buried in it. Not only buried in it, but mummified Egyptian style to be buried in it. And he was indeed, when he died, he was indeed allegedly embalmed Egyptian style. I think it took 2 weeks rather than the 70 days, which an Egyptian style really ought to have taken. I'm not sure how thorough it actually was. Also, slight problem, this is actually made for a woman, quite a small woman, yet the Duke was 6 foot. And there are 2 versions as how they got him in. Either they broke his legs to fit him in, or they cut his feet off. And for up until the early 1920s, it stood on a pedestal in this rather elaborate mausoleum that the Duke had built for him and his ancestors. Unfortunately, his descendants sold off the coal reserves underneath the estate, and it dropped 20 feet. It subsided by some 20 feet. It was evacuated to the local cemetery, and therefore the Duke, in in his stone coffin now lies in this plot in Bent Cemetery, just outside Hamilton, which is just outside Glasgow. One would dearly love to excavate it, but apparently we are told that if it were dug up, there might be tax issues because it would then be sort of come back into circulation, having gone out of circulation. Don't know, but at the moment we've got no indication that the current Duke wants his ancestors dug up, so I think it's rather a moot point. But this sort of work in Scotland kicked off this project, this long-term project to deal with the coffins in provincial collections. It's interesting that although Egyptian coffins are fairly ubiquitous, and everybody, so when you talk about ancient Egypt, you think of coffins, actually very few of them have been published. And therefore, and even the British Museum's ones are very poorly published. So therefore this project is simply to try and get them out there. Starting off regionally, northwest, southwest, see when I'm still alive and I've done those two areas and carry on. But the idea is ultimately a printed volume, but what I'm doing is, as individual museums, chapters are complete, they're being PDF'd and put online. So they are becoming available via this website. My own local collection, British Museum and Art Gallery, clearly is somewhere which is high on my agenda to get covered. And it's quite interesting in also the history of how some of these coffins move around in time. Interestingly, the best illustration we have of the Egyptian coffin collection in its early days is this, which is a watercolour of a mummy unwrapping at the Bristol Institution in 1834. And the victim of the unwrapping lies here at the front. What's particularly interesting, though, is trying to identify these various pieces which were there in 1834, where they are now. This was actually done not at the museum building where things are today, but this one, the original Bristol Institution building, about 100 yards away, which is now the local Masonic Hall. But first of all, as far as the victim of the unwrapping down here, well, she allegedly was destroyed in 1906, but actually found a headless skeleton in a box a few years ago, which we think probably is her. Moving around the rest of the thing, on the top of the top shelf at the back there, well, this is an enlargement of the watercolour. The trough of the coffin is still in the museum, but the lid isn't. It was destroyed in 1957, and I'll come back to that destruction. Shows obviously how little was understood about coffins at that time. This is a white coffin from the early 18th dynasty, and is probably the only example in the country. But at the time, the lid was simply destroyed because it was dirty and woodwork. Nobody recognised it was actually probably one of the most unique bits of stuff in the collection. This one, however, is fine. He's still there. He's one of the earliest things to come to the museum. He's in a tin box and doesn't get out much. At least he's still there. But the fun comes with these ones, because, well, first of all, not the fun. The non-fun bit is that one. Like the lid of the other one, they were both destroyed. In 1957. No photos ever taken. All we have is the watercolour plus a few notes which have been taken in the late 1890s and 1930s. However, not necessarily completely gone, because while doing this project we found in the reserves this face of a coffin and this fragment of the base of the trough, which do seem to be part of it. So it looks as though when it was being broken up to go into the museum furnace in 1957, a couple of the nicer bits which weren't too woodwormy were kept and are still in the collection. But also, what's also rather interesting though, is that this coffin, which is this one, and this coffin here are identifiable. They're not actually in the Bristol collection anymore. They're now in Plymouth, where they appeared in 1919. So why are they in Plymouth and not out? Because they were clearly part of the collection in 1834, and there was no sort of breaking up of the collection subsequently. Well, it seems to be all down to this gentleman, Thomas Pease, who was a major philanthropist in Bristol during the mid-19th century, and he was the treasurer of the Museum Society at the time when the museum moved from that earlier building I showed to the one at the bottom there. And we know that at the time when it was moved, there was insufficient space for all the collections. It was very much a natural history museum, and the only archaeological stuff that was given any case space at all was the Egyptian stuff. But what looks like happened was that because it couldn't all fit into the museum, he took these couple of coffins home. He already had an Egyptian collection, and he decided, what seems to have happened was that he said, look, I'll give them some house room until we've got enough space. Unfortunately, he then dropped down dead while having a Quaker meeting, leaving a young family who had no idea that the stuff, the coffins, didn't actually belong to the rest of Thomas Pease's collection. And then in 1919, when his widows, just after his widow had died and his collections were being dispersed, the coffins were actually offered to Bristol, who refused them on the ground of lack of space, not realising they already owned them. Quaker meeting has been interesting because it later became the local register office, whereas I was actually married. Probably was in the spot where Thomas Pease dropped down dead. And it's now a brasserie blanc restaurant. So anyway, these things ended up in Plymouth. And it was only a few years ago that we untangled the story and realised they actually belonged to Bristol anyway. But of course, they weren't demanded back. In fact, the fragments of the outer coffin, which went with them, were actually now on loan. So here we actually have that face from the outer coffin. So there's been at least an attempt to reunite the bits which can be identified. And just one other sort of place where I was invited to work on the coffin collection was in Stockholm. Material belonging to the National Museum, most of which is now in the Mediterranean Museum, which is an amalgamation of a number of different museums around Stockholm. A couple of just a few interesting pieces. I talked earlier on about around this period, 1100 to 900 or so, of coffins being remanufactured. One thing which we managed to find there was one which it wasn't just simply a few centuries, but over 1,000 years between making and remanufacture. This coffin, the core of it, actually was probably made around about 1500 BC. The decoration on it dates to around about 200 or so BC. So again, this looks like it's a case of a coffin which has long since been robbed, being found by some means or other, and then returned to a coffin maker's workshop to be redecorated. The exterior is totally this later date. The interior is still the original 1500 BC decoration. Another interesting piece is this one. It's clearly been mucked around with quite a bit. The Egyptians did not use a green and pink gloss paint, for example, which is some of this striping on it. It's also strange in that the text on it is all in the wrong order. It's parts of genuine Egyptian inscription, but not in the right order at all. And what turns out is that this text has been copied from papyrus. This coffin seems to have come to Europe in the early 19th century, and it was quite badly knocked around. For sale, it was then tarted up with modern paint. They needed somewhere to take the text from, and they found on this papyrus being published in the very beginning of the 19th century, some hieroglyphs would fit in nicely. So they did so. Unfortunately, we've got no idea whether or not the the text has anything to do with this coffin at all, or simply that the coffin refurbisher used this as a convenient place to get it from. One of the things about sort of studying these things is sometimes it's not too easy to get at things. This coffin, for example, it was on a shelf, and without some rather stronger people than the people who were available, we couldn't get it off the shelf. So therefore, the only way of examining the interior is to stick a camera through the hole here, and we got a nice view of this beautiful goddess's figure, which is painted on the bottom, and this gorgeous piece of work. So you normally find Egyptian things are painted on layer of plaster. Here, very, very high quality wood has allowed them to paint directly on it. And the high quality of this outer coffin, a man called back end ram, is borne out by the quality of the innermost coffin, which is one of the finest ones of the period I've come across, with a very finely inlaid, with a face inlaid with glass, and this motif on the back, so called jed pillar, it's normally just painted flat. This actually has been modelled in relief. To examine this properly, we had a little problem, and it was occupied. So we had to take back and red out of the coffin to be able to examine the trough properly. In this case, the museum hadn't got any porters available, so a tamai was put out to members of museum staff. Anybody fancy come and move a mummy? And we got a whole load of volunteers. So I think we've got the museum accountant and one of the security guards helping out with taking him out of the coffin. And we've got another team of people coming. It was the best thing that had happened to them in years. If we had to go home, they'd actually moved a mummy. The reason why I wanted to take him out particularly was because the quality of the interior decoration of this coffin is absolutely superb. And so therefore we're able to record that properly. There's a whole load of other sort of stories one can tell around the Egyptian coffins. Just to finish off one where it's probably I'm not sure whether it's unwitting or not, this bit of artistic. This coffin here has got the usual, this is the goddess Nut across the front of it here. But she looks rather nervous. And if you then follow her gaze, it's down to this little snake who's down the side of the coffin. So I'd love to do something. I don't have a caption competition on this one. What actually is she thinking, and what is the amazingly happy-looking snake one trying to say to her? With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed that immensely. I would like to take some questions. Is it okay with you?
Fine, yes.
I'll give you a few and then perhaps you can answer them in one block. Perhaps I could kick off. I was very interested in the change from the body lying on the left-hand side to lying face up, and wondered if there was a reason for that, whether it's a theological basis for that. And I was also, leading on from that, interested in whether or not these changes which you set out so clearly for us, to what extent those were driven by sort of socio-economic change, or whether, it was theologically driven. So
I think the switch from on the side to on the back is very much part of the change from the conception of the Anthropoid coffin. So they do appear before the mummy moves on to its back, but they're clearly considered not as being standalone containers, but as overgrown masks almost. So because the body is, they are lying on their sides as well. I think it's when the jump was made, and we don't really know why, to the idea of an Anthropoid coffin being viable as a separate thing. But the very fact that when it does become a separate thing, it ceases to be painted to look like a wrapped mummy, but turns into this feathered thing. So I think there is clearly some kind of theological jump at that point, but we can't actually get at the thought processes behind it. As far as some of the other ones are concerned, most of them are not, unlike this big jump from simply a masked mummy to a feathered being. The other ones, the actual underlying iconography normally that stays unchanged. It's the colour scheme which moves on. My suspicion is this may purely be an artistic move by those who create them. And it's also interesting that the earliest yellow coffin, that jump from the black to the yellow, the earliest yellow coffin actually belongs to a tomb workman, not to anybody of any particular high status, but rather workman royal tomb whose community produced a lot of high status funerary equipment. So one wonders almost whether there's an artist is decided to do something different, has always tried it out on his own community, and then it becomes more, because it takes quite some time for the black coffin to go out completely. It's about possibly a century between the first yellow coffins appearing and the black ones completely going out of fashion. So this seems, which is a far longer period than sort of the fight between the feathered, the yellow, the white and the black. So what's going on we don't really know, but there's some interesting stuff happening. It's also in that kind of period, you also get these daily life ones. So whether or not these things are driven by the theologians deciding something, or whether a craftsman produces something, and there may then be a retrospective theological thinking around it. The trouble is all we've got in the actual coffin, we've got no other data to allow us to make that kind of judgment.
Thank you very much. Can I take some other questions?
A long time ago, like 60 years ago, my father took me as a boy, really, just to visit Sir Leonard Woolley. And Woolley, as a young man, had worked in the Ashmolean Museum, and he told us all sorts of amusing stories, which possibly are even true. But one story was that he was in the Ashmolean, and he was actually inside some Egyptian coffin. Now, whether it was one of these sort of box-type ones that you showed us at the beginning, or more anthropomorphic one, I don't know. But he was scraping away or looking at it, and he wasn't visible. And a group of clergymen came round, and they were looking at this thing and pointing and said, that's very, very interesting. It said, men had hoped to death the 31st. Mentioned in the Bible, it's the book of, and Woolley from the tomb said, Kings, chapter 4, verses 29 to 36. And the curtains sort of cross themselves. Now, if that is a true story, I wonder whether this particular coffin, or rectangular coffin, could be identified in the Ashmolean, and perhaps your work when you get round rocks for children.
I know the material. I think it's the story could be true in the sense that a colleague of mine did exactly the same thing in a pyramid in Egypt.
Right.
He was examining the interior of this sarcophagus, which you can only get because the lid was partly broken away, so you had to sort of crawl into the thing. And he was copying inscriptions inside, and a tour group came in. He waited until everything was quiet and stuck his head out. And at the time he had a rather wild black beard. It was apparently there were screams. But going back to that question, I think it's been embroidered there because there's certainly no coffin in the ash which belongs to anybody who is who's mentioned in the Bible. So whether the clergyman was getting it wrong, but the story said it has. I know someone who's done something similar. So,
yes.
The thing is, of course, Woolley was a great raconteur.
Yes.
So I'm sure there's probably a grain of truth somewhere in it.
Thank you.
As part of your studying, are you looking at the reasons why these particular coffins ended up in a museum? And whether there's anything particular about a coffin that ends up in a museum? Is it more decorated? Is it more colourful? Is it, or is it something to do with?
I'm very interested in how they got. In some cases, the actual story of how they got there is more interesting than the actual coffins themselves. Some of them aren't, they're very beautiful, but some of them are actually sort of more of the same kind of thing. It varies. Some ended up in museums simply because the collector died and his wife wanted to get rid of them. And I think it's quite a few of them which appear to have just made it that way. Others actually got no idea how they came to the museum at all. There's one in Bristol, which the first thing we know of it is when it's given an inventory number in 1917, along with a whole load of other stuff. It could have been there for 100 years. We've no idea how it got there. A lot of the provincial ones do come from private collectors. They have been acquired on the Grand Tour, some from dealers. Say sometimes it's because they're particularly nice ones. You know, certainly back in Wren, that's absolutely glorious thing. I'm sure that sort of was required for that. But others are fairly workaday ones, and there are some good stories. I don't think there's any sort of consistent thing behind them, unfortunately. What is interesting though is a lot of them, very few of them, have still got their mummies in them. A lot of them seem to have lost their mummies along the way. Probably because, again, there are probably various people whose spouses probably said, "Okay, you can have that Egyptian wooden box. I'm not having a dead body in my sitting room."
Have you considered, as part of the project, any 3D recording of the coffins?
Personally, I have. This is very much sort of a personal project, unfunded, sort of as and when. But there's a project which is being done jointly by the Rijksmuseum and Birdhead and Vatican Museums and the Louvre about recording coffins in their collections, with the idea of actually producing a basic way of doing things. At the moment it's more in 2D, but they're certainly experimenting with what more can be done. So I think there is some scope for that. Probably not in my project, unless I can get some big bucks for it. At the moment it's really just, the problem with a lot of these things, people didn't even know they exist. The first thing you know is when you go into the place and, you know. So at the moment it's really a question of getting the basic data together. But certainly that sort of 3D imaging is something which is being thought of by certain rather more well-funded programs anyway.
Thank you very much for the talk. One thing which I'm curious about is these coffins are clearly very multiple and were collected in the 19th century. You showed one which clearly had hieroglyphics added onto it from a completely separate source. Have you actually suddenly come across fakes? If they're highly moneyed individuals who are after these, well, there might be fakes around.
I've never found a fake complete coffin. I found fake things which purport to be bits of coffins. But actually coffin, I don't think I've ever come across one which is a complete fake coffin. They fake mummies, but the coffins themselves, I think, were sufficiently sort of plentiful at the time, not to be. I'm just trying to think whether the nearest thing I think of actually a fake coffin is where it's been partly, when there's been sort of very, very heavily restored. So whether or not it's what's a fake and what's a sort of a piece where the actual original bit of antiquity is yay big and they've sort of extrapolated the rest of it. There's certainly one in Liverpool whereby I think there was a bit of original, but the rest of it is hypothetical, shall we say.
In one of the last items you showed in your lecture, you had an inscription which you said had been taken or painted from a publication, and on the right-hand side, you have the name of Denon.
That's it, yes.
Yeah. Vivant.
That's the
Baron Denon visited Egypt with Napoleon's expedition.
Mm-hmm.
And he did wash drawings of many sites, including Oxyrhynchus, which is how I've come across him. But that material of Denon will tie in with that man.
Yeah. In fact, I didn't really have more time. I could say that actually he actually had quite a considerable Egyptian collection of his own.
Yes, I'm sure he did.
And at one point, I did wonder whether this might actually belong to. In fact, when I published it a few years ago, I did actually suggest it might actually be something which is in the Denon catalogue.
But his collection of topographical drawings it's considerable.
Yeah. But also about actually antiquities. Unfortunately, colleague at British Museum has now disabused me of this, and what I thought it was is actually in Newcastle, Fontine of all places. It's a fascinating thing. Whether as the owner of the papyrus is a grandson of a pharaoh, quite an important person, and one would love to know whether this actually is his coffin, which somebody has then sort of retrospectively put the text on, or whether it's a
text got to do with St. Petersburg.
That's where the papyrus now is.
That's where it now is.
Yes, Denon's papyri have ended up in St. Petersburg in the National Museum.
His topographical drawings are kept.
Don't know, unfortunately. I think they might. I suspect as they were difficult to know.
If you look at the specialist volume on the town books of Incas, which was produced by the Egyptian Restoration Society about 9 or 10 years ago, you will find some of the early drawings there, and perhaps how they moved around. There's drawings of Oxford Incas and of other sites as well.
I'll have a look at them next time I'm in the library tomorrow.
Thank you.
I'll take one more question.
I was just wondering, what is the scale of the number of coffins in the collections, roughly?
If one counts, it's one of that. It's into three figures anyway. The British Museum has got a lot. I'm not sure. Things when you count as a whole, we've got nests of 3 and whatever. I reckon it's probably a couple of hundred at least of actually complete coffins, and as far as fragments thereof, the sky's the limit, almost.
Well, on behalf of us all, thank you very much indeed. I think we've all learned an enormous amount from the lecture. It was informative and well illustrated and very entertaining. I particularly enjoyed, thank you, the time depth, because my time depth on Egypt is not that good, so to have that initial slide, I don't know about everybody else, was extremely helpful, and I really did enjoy having a chronological journey through those coffins, which will give me certainly far more interest and understanding when I visit museums and whistle through those collections in the future. I shall stop. And I'm also delighted to see somebody working so effectively with archives, because as I think we all know, archives are an element of the heritage sector which we all ponder about and think about whether we're really getting the value from them. So clearly you are, and it's great to see you making this material accessible. And we wish you very well in the future with your studies. Thank you very much indeed.